The rope snapped taut around Clayton Slater's waist just as the sea cave floor gave way beneath him. And the only reason he did not plunge 30 feet into the tidal surge below was the iron grip of a green-skinned hand closing around his wrist like a bear trap. He dangled for one terrible heartbeat, the black water churning beneath him, salt spray stinging his eyes, and then he was hauled upward with a single savage pull that left him sprawling on solid stone, gasping, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. "Move," said a voice like gravel wrapped in silk. "Floor will not hold in this section. Move now, human." Clayton scrambled forward on hands and knees, following the sound of heavy boots striking stone with absolute certainty, until the passage widened into a chamber lit by a single oil lantern hung from an iron spike driven into the cave wall. He sat back on his heels and finally looked at the person who had just saved his life. She was tall, nearly a head taller than his own 6 feet, and built the way storm-carved cliffs are built, with a solidity that suggested she had never in her life been uncertain about whether she would remain standing. Her skin was the deep, warm green of old copper, her hair a dense black tumble of braids and loose waves that fell past her broad shoulders, and her eyes, when they caught the lantern light, were the amber color of river water over sand. She wore fitted warrior's leathers, dark brown and well-worked, laced tight from hip to shoulder in a way that left no question about the strength of the frame beneath, with tooled bracers at her forearms and a short axe at each hip that rode there as naturally as other women wore earrings. A single elaborate braid fell over her left shoulder thicker than the others, woven through with a cord of deep red and a slip of hammered copper, and it caught the light in a way that made it look deliberate, intentional, almost ceremonial. Clayton did not think about the braid. He was thinking about the fact that the floor of the smuggler's cove had just tried to eat him. "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. "Clayton Slater. I am the well digger the settlement council hired. I was supposed to be checking the freshwater seep in the lower passage." "I know who you are," she said, not unkindly but with the blunt efficiency of someone who considered pleasantries a waste of breath. "Borgakh Doomhammer. I hold the eastern caves for Chief Vorokh's warband. You should not be in this section without a guide." "The guide did not show up. He is dead." She said it without a change in expression, simply correcting a misconception. "Raider scouts killed him 2 days ago. No one told you." "No one told me," Clayton said flatly. Borgakh looked at him for a moment, long and measuring, and then she reached for the lantern. "Come, I will take you to the seep." That was how it started. The settlement of Covenside clung to the base of the sea cliffs like a barnacle to a ship's hull. A collection of low stone buildings, net-drying racks, a rough tavern called the Silt and the Stone, a trading post, and a warren of cellars and passages that opened below the tide line into the smugglers' coves that had made this stretch of coast infamous for 3 generations. The coves ran deep, riddled with natural chambers and carved-out galleries, and they held something no other settlement on this coast could claim. A freshwater spring that welled up through a crack in the limestone, cold and clear, enough to supply drinking water for 300 people if properly managed. Clayton had been brought in from the inland valley specifically to find a way to pipe that spring up through the cliff face, and into a cistern the settlement could actually use. He had been doing this work digging wells, redirecting springs, cutting channels through rock, for 9 years, since he was 22, since his father's small holding had dried up and there had been nothing left to do but take the skills his father had taught him and turn them into a trade. He was good at it. He was not good at much else. He was often told, in the way that people say such things and mean it as a compliment but land it as a slight. Good with a shovel, good with a rope. Good for hard work and hard weather and the kind of jobs no one else wanted. He had come to Covenside alone, as he came to most places alone, with a pack on his back and a contract in his belt pouch and the quiet, competent solitude that had become his natural state. He was not unhappy. He had simply stopped expecting anything more than the next job, the next seep, the next dry valley that needed saving. Borgakh walked ahead of him through the passage, the lantern swinging, her shadow huge and shifting on the wet stone walls. She moved without hesitation, reading the floor beneath her feet with the experience of long familiarity, stepping over the sections that were undermined by the tidal chambers below, ducking without breaking stride beneath a low overhang that would have taken Clayton's head off if he had not been watching her. "How long have you been in the coves?" he asked. 6 months. Since Vorakh's band took the eastern contracts. She did not slow down. Before that, the northern clans held this coast. There was a war. Vorakh's band won. Now we hold it. And the settlement council just accepts that. The council accepts that we keep the raider ships from landing. In return, they do not try to throw us out. She glanced back at him, one amber eye catching the light. It is a practical arrangement. The guide who died, was he killed by raiders or by someone who does not want the practical arrangement to continue? She stopped. She turned and looked at him properly for the first time with the full attention of someone who had just recalibrated what she was dealing with. "You are quicker than you look," she said. "People always think that," Clayton said simply. Something shifted in her expression, not a smile, not quite, but something adjacent to it. She turned back to the passage. "Come, the seep is another 100 yards." The freshwater spring emerged from a crack in the south wall of a chamber the locals called the receiving room, because 3 generations of smugglers had used it to count and sort their contraband before moving it up the cliff to the settlement. It was roughly circular, about 40 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to a cathedral height where the natural limestone had fractured and pulled apart. The spring trickled from the crack in a thin, constant sheet, pooling in a carved stone basin that someone had chiseled out of the floor decades ago. By Clayton's estimate, it was producing about 30 gallons an hour, more than enough, if he could cap it properly and run a pipe up through the northern chimney passage to a surface cistern. He crouched beside it, pressing his palms to the stone on either side to feel the moisture pattern, pressing his ear to the rock to listen for the deep, low singing that told him how far back the source went and how much pressure was behind it. Borgakh stood at the chamber entrance and watched him do this without comment, which he appreciated. Most people could not resist explaining to him what he was already doing. "It is deeper than it looks," he said, finally sitting back. "The source is at least 60 feet into the rock. That is good. It means it will not dry in summer. The crack is widening, though I can feel the fracture running. In a few years, without intervention, the whole section of wall might fail and the spring would lose pressure entirely or redirect into the tidal chambers below and turn salt. How much time do we have? 3 years, maybe 4. If I cap it now and run the pipe this season, the settlement has water for as long as the cliff stands." He looked up at her, "Assuming the settlement is still here in 3 years. "Assuming," she agreed, and there was something in that single word that carried the weight of everything she was not saying. He found out what she was not saying later that evening, in the taproom of the Silt and the Stone, when the settlement council laid out the situation for him with the bluntness of people who had stopped having the energy to soften bad news. The raider fleet was coming. Not scouts, not probes, the whole fleet, commanded by a man named Duret the Unsmiling, who had been building his strength for 2 years off the northern islands and now considered this stretch of coast his by right of might. The practical arrangement between the settlement and Vorakh's warband had been holding the coast for 6 months, but Duret had more ships and more men than Borgakh had warriors. The council's estimate was 40 days before the fleet arrived, possibly less if Duret moved faster than expected. The settlement had no walls. It had the coves, which were defensible, and it had Vorakh's warband, which was experienced and fierce, and it had the cliffs, which were difficult terrain for an attacking fleet, but without a reliable water supply in the coves, they could not hold a siege for more than 5 days before thirst forced them into the open. Which was why the council had hired Clayton. Which was why completing the pipe from the spring to the surface cistern was no longer simply a useful improvement to the settlement's infrastructure. It was the difference between surviving a raid and dying in one. No pressure, the council chairman had said, with the bleak humor of someone who had already accepted the possibility of his own death. Clayton had finished his ale, thanked the council, and gone to bed in the small room above the trading post that had been assigned to him. He lay on the narrow cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about the job, because thinking about the job was how he had always managed the things that might otherwise be too large to look at directly. He saw Borgakh the next morning at the cliff face, checking the rope and pulley systems that Vorakh's warband used to haul supplies from the coves to the settlement above. She was working a frayed section of rope through a block and replacing it with fresh cord, her big hands moving with a dexterity that did not match their size, and she did not look up when he approached, but she acknowledged him with a slight tilt of her head. "I know about Durat," he said without preamble, because she had appreciated the directness the day before. "Good," she said. "Then you know why the water matters. I am going to need help in the lower passage. Someone who knows the floor layout well enough to tell me which sections are undermined. Someone who can carry equipment." She paused, considering the rope in her hands. "Borgakh will not spare warriors for water digging." "I'm not asking for warriors, I'm asking for you." She looked up then. The morning light was direct and honest, and it made her look exactly like what she was, formidable, self-possessed, and slightly surprised. "Why me?" "Because you knew the floor yesterday without looking at it. Because you did not waste time asking me questions I did not need to answer. Because you did not explain things to me that I already knew." He met her eyes steadily. "You are the most useful person I have encountered in this settlement in 3 days, and I have a job to do in 40 days or fewer." Borgakh was quiet for a moment. Then she looped the rope once around the block with a single practiced motion, tied it off, and said, "I will speak to Borgakh." Borgakh was a broad, scarred orc of about 50 who ran his warband with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had survived long enough to know that sentiment and strategy rarely lived in the same house. He was also, it turned out, deeply invested in the water project, because he understood sieges in the way that only someone who had lost one could. "Take her," he said before Borgakh had finished explaining. "Take whoever you need for the pipe work. We hold the coast or we die here. Pick whichever you would prefer." Which was how Clayton Slater, well digger, found himself spending his days in the sea caves of Covenside working alongside Borgakh Doomhammer, and how the 40 days before the raider fleet arrived became the most densely felt weeks of his adult life. The work was real and physical and demanding, and they fell into a rhythm of it with a naturalness that surprised him. He laid out the plan. She anticipated the problems before he voiced them. He moved through the lower passages with growing confidence because she was always a step ahead of him, reading the rock, testing the floor, pointing wordlessly at the sections where the limestone had gone hollow and soft. He cut the pipe channel in the spring's rock face with a cold chisel and hammer, and she held the lantern and also, without being asked, held the line that kept him from toppling sideways into the collection basin when the angle of the work got awkward. They ate their noon meal in the receiving room most days, bread and salt fish, and whatever the settlement kitchen had managed that morning, sitting on opposite sides of the spring basin with their boots drying near the small oil lamp between them, and they talked. Not small talk. Clayton had never been good at small talk, and Borgakh seemed to regard it with active suspicion, the way a person regards a food they once found made them ill. They talked about the work, about the rock formations, about the raider fleet's likely approach vectors, and what the cove's natural geography offered in terms of defensive choke points. They talked about where he had worked before, the dry valleys of the eastern marches, the high-altitude settlements in the Ridgeback passes where the snowmelt was the only water source, and he had spent 2 winters in near-total isolation cutting channels through frozen ground. They talked, carefully at first and then with more directness, about the war between Vorakh's clan and the northern clans and what it had cost. "You lost people," he said once, not as a question. "I lost my war brother," she said. "Gortak. He was beside me for 11 years. She paused. He was killed in the pass at Redhorn in the last season of fighting. I am sorry. So am I." She looked at the spring water moving in its basin, clear and constant and indifferent to anything that happened in the world above it. He would have liked this, the coves. He liked places that had hidden depth. She glanced at Clayton. "He would have liked you, I think." "Why?" "Because you say what you mean and you do not pretend to be more important than the work." She picked up her bread. "It is rare." Clayton turned that over in his mind for a long time after. The way you turn a river-worn stone and discover its weight is different from what you expected. He had begun to notice her. He was honest enough with himself to admit it without qualification. He noticed the way she moved through the narrow passages with her shoulders slightly angled to fit, and how she never made him feel apologetic for being smaller, the way some very large people did inadvertently. He noticed her hands, the scarred knuckles, the precise grip, the way she spread her palm against the cave wall to read its temperature the way he had taught her in the first week, and which she had immediately mastered. He noticed the braid over her left shoulder. The elaborate one, woven through with the red cord and the copper slip. It was different from her other braids. They were practical, pinned close to her scalp or tied at her nape to keep them out of the way, but this one hung free and deliberate and seemingly inviolate. She never touched it. He never saw her adjust it. It simply was, present and particular, and he found his eyes going to it in the way eyes go to things that have a meaning they cannot quite parse. On the 12th day of the project, the thing happened. They were in the northern chimney passage, which was a narrow vertical shaft in the cliff face that connected the receiving room to a shelf of rock about 20 feet below the surface, and which Clayton had identified as the best route for the pipe. He was measuring the shaft's interior diameter at head height, one hand braced on the wall, the other reaching across to feel the opposite face, and Borgakh was standing very close beside him holding the measuring line, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, which was considerable, the way a banked forge is warm without being hot. The braid slipped forward over her shoulder as she leaned slightly to read the knot marks on the line, and the end of it, the copper slip at the tip, brushed against the back of his hand. He caught it without thinking, a purely reflexive thing, the instinct of someone who has spent years keeping small objects from dropping into crevices and losing them to the dark. His fingers closed around the braid just above the copper weight, holding it, and he turned slightly to hand it back to her. He saw her face. She had gone entirely still, not tense, not alarmed, but still in the way that a deep pool goes still, the surface suddenly smooth and unreadable, and everything happening underneath. Her amber eyes were fixed on his hand where it held her braid, and they were wide, not wide with fear, wide with something he had never seen precisely catalogued on anyone's face before, something that was part shock and part something else, something very old and very specific to her, something with weight and history in it that he was entirely outside of. "I am sorry," he said immediately, releasing it. "It fell forward. I did not want it to go into the shaft." She looked at him. He looked back at her, holding the measuring line in both hands now, genuinely uncertain what he had done. She closed her eyes. Just for a moment, just for 3 or 4 seconds, she closed her eyes and breathed very slowly through her nose, and whatever was passing through her, she chose not to let it become words. When she opened them again, her expression was something closer to neutral, and she reached up and lifted the braid back over her shoulder and settled it where it belonged. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not letting it fall." "Of course," Clayton said, and went back to his measuring. That night, alone in his room above the trading post, he thought about her face in that moment, the way she had closed her eyes, the decision in it. He was not a man who fancied himself perceptive about such things. He had never been. It was simply not a skill his life had called for, but he was good at reading the ground beneath him, at sensing the pressure behind the rock, at knowing when something deep was close to the surface. He lay on the cot and he thought about that closed-eye breath, and he thought about the braid, and he thought, slowly and carefully, the way he thought about difficult geology, that he had done something without knowing what he was doing. He asked Marit, the trading post's owner, in the most casual way he could manage the next morning over breakfast. The orc woman, Borgakh. The braid she wears over her left shoulder, with the copper weight. Do you know what it means? Marit was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had been trading on this coast for 30 years and knew approximately everything. She put her cup down and looked at him with an expression that suggested she was deciding how much to explain. Among Vorakh's clan, Marit said carefully, an orc warrior who is of an age and standing to take a mate wears a courtship braid. It is placed by the warrior themselves, woven with specific markers that tell others, those who know the custom, that the warrior is in a state of choosing. Open, available. She paused. The tradition is that if someone touches the braid deliberately or even accidentally in the warrior's presence, it is read by the clan's customs as a declaration, an expression of intent to court. Clayton put his own cup down very carefully. I touched it. You touched it. I was keeping it from falling into a pipe shaft. Yes, Marit said with the neutrality of someone staying out of it. I imagine she knows that. Is there a response required by the custom? The warrior who wears the braid can refuse the declaration, or accept it, or, Marit added, stirring her bowl, simply not address it if the circumstances are complicated. She chose not to explain, Clayton thought. She closed her eyes, and she chose not to say a word. He sat with that through the whole morning, in the cold of the lower passages with the hammer and chisel, and what he sat with was not primarily the embarrassment of having stumbled into a cultural declaration he had not intended, and was not the social uncertainty of not knowing how to proceed. What he sat with was the memory of her face in the moment before she closed her eyes, the wideness of it, and the very specific, very honest question it raised, which was, had there been something in that wideness that was not merely surprise? He went to find her in the afternoon. She was at the cliff face again, running new rope through the eastern pulley system. He came up beside her without preamble and said, I know what the braid means. I found out this morning. Her hands continued working the rope. She did not stop, but he saw the small tightening at her jaw that meant she was deciding something. I did not mean to declare anything, he said. If the custom requires a withdrawal, I will make it. I do not want to. He stopped, started again. I did not want to create an obligation you did not choose. She tied off the rope with a single clean motion and turned to face him. You did not create an obligation, she said. The custom does not compel the warrior. Only the warrior compels the warrior. She held his gaze. I chose not to explain in the passage. Because I did not. She stopped in turn, and he recognized the pause because he lived in it himself, the pause of a person deciding how honest to be. I did not know what I wanted to do about it. Do you know now? The wind came off the sea at that moment, cold and salt-heavy, and it lifted the loose ends of her braids and the deliberate courtship braid together, and for a moment everything was moving. Then it settled. I know that you are not a man who does things carelessly, she said. I know that you came here to tell me about it as soon as you learned, which means you are honest, which is not common. She looked at him steadily. I know that I have been watching you work for 12 days, and I have not been merely watching the work. Something settled in Clayton's chest. Not resolution. More like the moment when a level confirms what the body already suspected, that the ground is true. I have been watching you too, he said. I should tell you that since you just told me that. Yes, she agreed with a gravity that was not unkind. You should. They stood there in the sea wind at the top of the cliff path, and it was not quite a declaration and not quite a resolution, and was perhaps, Clayton thought, something more honest than either. Two people at the edge of something, both looking at it, both deciding to keep looking instead of turning away. The days that followed had a different quality. Not softer. The work was still hard. The stone was still cold. The job was still pressing, but charged. He was aware of her in the way he was aware of the rock under his feet in a difficult passage. Constantly, carefully, with a respect for what it could do that was entirely separate from fear. She began to position herself differently in the caves, he noticed. Closer. Not touching, not obviously close, but within a range that felt deliberate, that felt like a claim being laid without words. When he handed her the measuring line, their fingers overlapped on it for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. When she pointed out a structural feature in the passage wall, she leaned slightly so that her shoulder pressed against his, and she did not pull away, and neither did he. On the 18th day, with 22 to go before the estimated fleet arrival, they were working in the receiving room capping the spring, a careful process that involved a clay and lime seal around the pipe inlet that had to be pressed in with hands and held steady while it set, and both their hands were plunged to the wrist in cold clay and lime paste, both leaning over the basin, foreheads nearly touching in the cramped angle of the work. "Hold it there," he said quietly, because the seal had to be evenly distributed and she was better positioned to hold the left side. "Don't let it shift." "I have it," she said. They held the seal in the wet dark, hands buried, faces close, the lantern swinging slightly in the cave's breath. "Borgakh," he said. "Yes. This is going to sound—" He stopped and started again. "I'm not good at this." "I know," she said, and there was no impatience in it. "Say it anyway." "I want to court you," he said. "I know I stumbled into the beginning of it accidentally, but now I know what it means and I am saying it on purpose." He paused. "I want to, if you will let me." The clay was cold around both their wrists. The spring moved in its stone basin. The lantern swung. "You are already courting me," she said. "You have been for 18 days. You simply did not have the word for it." She turned her head slightly so that her forehead did rest against his temple for just a moment, warm and real. "Yes, I will let you." He turned and kissed her on the side of her jaw, because that was what he could reach in the angle they were in, and it felt exactly right, not tentative, but certain and careful, the way you make the first cut in good stone. She made a low sound, not quite a word, that resonated in her chest and seemed to move through the rock and through him both. "The seal has to hold for 20 minutes, he said. "I know," she said. "I am holding it." They stayed just like that, hands buried in clay, and it was absurd and it was exactly right. The news arrived on the 23rd day, which was 17 days before the fleet's estimated arrival window. A fishing boat that had come around the headland at full sail with a man at the bow screaming. Durat had moved faster than anyone predicted. Not 40 days, 25. The fleet had been seen from the lookout station at Cape Greywall. 14 ships. Moving south along the coast at a pace that put them at Covenside in 2 days, possibly less. The settlement exploded into a controlled panic that Clayton had seen before, in flood-threatened valleys, in high passes when the snow began to crack. The specific frenzy of people who have been preparing for a bad thing, and have just been told the bad thing is arriving earlier than the preparation could be completed. He had 17 days of pipe work done out of what should have been an entire 40. The channel was cut, the spring was capped, the pipe was laid through the chimney shaft all the way to the shelf below the surface. But the surface cistern had not been built, and without it, the pipe simply emptied onto rock and the water was lost. He needed 3 days to build the cistern properly. He did not have 3 days. He had 1 night and 1 morning. He told Borgakh in flat, plain terms what was done, what was not, what they needed, and how long it would take with maximum labor. She stood, listened, and when he had finished she said, "Tell me what bodies you need." And within the hour she had organized a working party of 6 war band members and 4 of the settlement's strongest adults, and she was moving equipment down the cliff path with the authority of someone who had never in her life waited to be told it was permissible to act. They worked through the night. All 10 of them, plus Clayton and Borgakh, cutting the cistern's shape into the shelf rock by torchlight, mortaring the walls with a lime mix that Merritt provided from the trading post stores, bracing the pipe inlet and capping the overflow. The torches smoked in the sea wind, and the rock dust got into everything, and no one said much because there was not time and not breath to spare. Clayton worked until his shoulders were a single sustained burning ache, until the chisel felt like it had fused to his right hand, and Borgakh was beside him the whole time, not supervisory, not standing back to direct, but in it, swinging a short-handled pick at the shelf rock with a mechanical, relentless precision that left him quietly in awe. At some point in the deep hours, probably well past midnight, she came and stood behind him, and without asking began pressing her thumbs in slow, deliberate circles into the muscle where his neck met his shoulder. And he stopped what he was doing and simply bowed his head forward and let her, because refusing would have been its own kind of foolishness. She worked the knot loose with the same patient thoroughness she applied to everything, and when she was done, she rested her hand briefly on the back of his neck, warm and still, and then she went back to her pick. He was in love with her. He knew it the way he knew when a spring was close, not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of evidence until the conclusion was inescapable. He was 31 years old, and he had never before felt about any person the way he felt about Borgakh Doomhammer, which was that her absence from a room made the room smaller and her presence in a dark cave made it, inexplicably, feel like somewhere worth being. The cistern was finished by dawn. Raw, rough-edged, not elegant by any measure but sealed and structurally sound. He uncapped the pipe inlet at the receiving room, and 20 minutes later they stood on the shelf and watched the pipe mouth shudder and deliver a thin, clear, cold stream of freshwater into the new stone basin, with a sound that Clayton had heard hundreds of times in his life, and which had never before made him feel as though he might actually cry. Borgakh stood beside him, covered in dust and lime and rock grit, and she reached over and took his hand and held it, and he turned his palm upward and held hers back. "It works," she said. "It works," he said. There was a sound from above, from the settlement, shouting, not celebration. The fleet had rounded the headland. The next 20 hours were the longest of Clayton Slater's life. Vorakh's warband sealed the sea cave entrances with everything available: heavy timber barricades, sharpened stakes driven into the sand at the waterline, rope nets strung between the cave pillars to slow any force that tried to come through the channel entries at low tide. The settlement above was largely abandoned, its people in the coves, which were defensible in a way the surface was not. The cliff path was blocked at 3 points with timber and stone barriers that a determined force could eventually break through, but not quickly, and not without cost. Durrett's fleet was large, but the coves were known to Vorakh's band and not to the raiders, and that asymmetry was the only real advantage they had. Clayton was not a soldier. He was a well-digger. He had a short knife he kept for utility work, which was not nothing but was not impressive either. Borgakh, who had placed him in a chamber well back from the main defense line, had been direct about this. Stay in the secondary passage. If it comes to the secondary passage, we have already lost, and you will know it because I will not be coming back. That is a bleak way to put it, he said. It is an honest way to put it, she said. She was standing in the entrance of the secondary passage, both axes at her hips, her braids pinned back, the courtship braid still hanging free over her left shoulder. He had noticed she had not bound it up even now, even in battle dress, which meant something to him even if he was not entirely sure yet what. She looked at him with those amber eyes in the cave's torchlight, and for a moment all the bluntness dropped away from her face, and what was underneath it was something that his chest recognized even if he did not have immediate words for it. "When this is over," she said, "we need to talk about the braid." "All right," he said. She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly, a gesture he had learned to read as her version of gathering herself. "I mean that I want to finish what was started, formally, by Orc custom." She held his gaze. "If you want that." "I want that," Clayton said. "I want that very much." She nodded once, and the bluntness came back, and she turned to the defense line, and he pressed his back against the secondary passage wall and waited. The attack came on the tide. He could hear it even far back in the rock, the crash of timber against the cave pillars, the shouts in the raider tongue that he did not speak, and the shorter, harder sounds of his warband holding their ground. He heard Borgakh's voice once, short and commanding, and then a series of sounds he chose not to interpret too specifically. He spent the waiting making himself useful in the only way available to him, the freshwater pipe. The cistern on the shelf above was full and sealed, but there was a secondary tap point he had built into the spring's cap, a valve that could flood the lower chimney passage with freshwater on demand. He had built it as a practical overflow control, but a flooded chimney passage, he now thought, would be one more obstacle in the coves that a raiding force did not want to navigate. He edged back to the receiving room, opened the valve 1/4 turn, let the water begin to fill the chimney shaft's lower section. Not a flood, but enough to make the footing in the shaft slick and uncertain for anyone who had not spent weeks learning its layout. He was coming back through the secondary passage when the floor collapsed beneath him. Not the undermined section near the main entrance, a different section, one that the fighting had apparently stressed, the tidal surge from 14 ships passing having amplified the wave action in the lower chambers beyond its normal range. The stone simply gave, with a sound like a shot, and he was falling. He hit a ledge 6 feet down and grabbed it with both hands and held on, his legs dangling over the surge chamber below, where the black water swirled and churned with the tidal pressure. The ledge was narrow and the stone was wet, and he could feel it shifting under his grip, not solid, undermined, a temporary hold. "Clayton," her voice above him. He looked up and she was there, flat on her stomach at the edge of the new hole, both hands reaching down, and the reach was barely enough. "Grab my wrist," she said. "The ledge might grab my wrist now," she said, in a voice that left no room for any other decision. He reached up and got her wrist, and she got his, and she pulled. He came off the ledge as it cracked and gave and fell into the surge below, and she dragged him up and over the edge of the hole, and they sprawled together on solid stone with her arms around him, and his face pressed against her chest, and both of them breathing hard in the dark. She held him. For a long moment she just held him, her arms a circle of warmth and absolute solidity around his shoulders, her chin resting on the top of his head, and he could feel the acceleration of her heartbeat against his cheek, and he knew the acceleration was for him, which was a thing he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You are not allowed," she said unevenly, with a roughness in her voice that he had never heard there before, "to fall into the tidal surge." "I know," he said into her leathers. "I did not plan to. Do not plan to again." Agreed. She did not let him go for another full minute. Neither of them moved. The sounds of the fighting were less now, shorter, more intermittent, and he was aware that something in the battle had shifted, that the volume and intensity had changed. But he did not move, and she did not make him move, and those 60 seconds of being held by her in the dark of the cave were something he had no better language for than simply right. Like the level confirming what the body knew, like cold water finding its own level, like the pipe delivering its first clear stream into the stone basin and proving that the thing was real. The raid broke before midday. Durat's ships, it turned out, had been built for speed and threat, not for the kind of sustained, grinding, intimate combat that Vorakh's warband was bred for. 3 ships had been lost trying to navigate the cave channels at the wrong tide. 1 to the nets Borgakh had strung between the pillars. 2 to the simple fact that the cove's currents were killing territory for anyone who did not know them. The flooding Clayton had sent down the chimney shaft had turned what should have been a second-wave advance route into a trap that cost Durat 24 men, and apparently his appetite for the whole operation. By the time the tide turned, the fleet was pulling back to a holding position north of the headland, and by evening the lookout reported them under sail and heading northeast, away from this coast entirely. The settlement came out of the coves in the late afternoon like people emerging from a dream. Blinking, salt-crusted, stunned to be alive. The surface buildings had been partially ransacked, a few stores taken, a few walls knocked in, but the structures were sound. The settlement was standing, and the cistern on the cliff shelf was full of cold, clear freshwater that would drink good and never taste of salt. Borgakh stood in the settlement's central square and said, in his warband's direct fashion, "We held the coast," and his warriors answered it with a single shout. and Merritt from the trading post gave a short speech about community and survival that Clayton did not fully follow because Borgakh was standing beside him, and he was more focused on the warmth of her arm against his than on civic oration. "You should be in the square," he said quietly. "Your warband held this coast." "I am where I want to be," she said, equally quietly. And then, because she was Borgakh and she had apparently decided that the day had given her sufficient grounds to be entirely honest, "I have been where I want to be for 12 days, since the chisel work in the northern chimney passage." He looked at her. "That was before I caught the braid." "I know." She looked back at him, amber and steady and completely certain. "I was already watching you. The braid was—" she paused, considering. "The braid was a recognition of what was already happening. An orc does not wear a courtship braid because they are looking. They wear it because they have found." Clayton was quiet for a moment. The settlement square was full of people and noise and the relief of survival, and he and Borgakh were in the edge of it, close together in their own quiet. "You had already found me," he said, "before I touched it." "Yes. And when I touched it, you had to decide whether to tell me or to let it go and see what happened." "Yes. You chose to let it go." She met his eyes. "I chose to see what you would do when you knew. Because I did not want someone who did not choose me on purpose." Her voice was even, but the depth beneath it was not. "I have been in arrangements that were not choices. I did not want that again." He reached up carefully with all the deliberateness he could muster and touched the courtship braid where it lay over her left shoulder, not catching it this time, simply placing his fingers around it, feeling the warmth of the cord and the copper weight, holding it with intention. He felt her stillness against his side. "I am choosing you on purpose," he said. "Is this how the formal declaration is made, in your clan's custom?" "It is one way," she said very quietly. "But the orc custom requires a claiming. A name binding, said aloud before witnesses." She glanced briefly at the crowd in the square. "Not now, not like this. Somewhere tomorrow," he said, "wherever you choose. I will be there." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he had not seen her do before. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, slow and deliberate, both hands rising to hold the sides of his face, and she closed her eyes. Not the closed eyes of that moment in the chimney passage, not the suspended decision of that held breath, but something else. Something that looked, from the outside, like the way you close your eyes when you have been carrying something for a long time and you have finally set it down. "Tomorrow," she said. He put his hands over hers where they held his face, and he said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be added. That night the settlement lit fires on the clifftop and ate the meal that had been saved for either celebration or final fellowship, depending on how the day went, and both outcomes had apparently been planned for in the food stores, which meant there was enough and more than enough. Clayton sat against the low cliff wall with a bowl of stew going cold in his hands and watched Borgakh across the fire. She was in a low-voiced conversation with Borgakh, her hands moving as she talked, and whatever she was telling him, Borgakh kept nodding with the expression of a man who had expected this news and was relieved to receive it, which Clayton found interesting. Merritt appeared beside him and settled onto the wall and stole a piece of bread from his bowl without asking. "She is telling Borgakh about the name binding," Merritt said. "She knew everything. Clayton had made peace with this. He will need to know because it changes the warband's arrangement somewhat." "How so?" "When an orc warrior name binds with a non-orc, the clan custom requires a testing period. A season of the warrior and the chosen living side by side in the warband's territory, serving the warband's purpose, before the binding is made permanent." Merritt tore the bread and ate half of it. "Effectively, you would winter here in the coves, working as part of the warband's extended community." "Wintering in the coves," Clayton said, "with Borgakh, in the eastern caves, which are considerably more comfortable than the working tunnels, I am told, with proper fur beds and hearth vents cut into the rock and—" "Yes," Clayton said, "I accept." Merritt looked at him with her 30 years of coast trading expression. "She has not formally asked yet." "Then I will be very easy to persuade when she does," he said. Borgakh came to him after Borgakh had retired and the fires were burning lower, while most of the settlement was drifting toward sleep or toward the warm noise of the silt and the stone, and she crouched beside him on the cliff wall in the way she had learned was his preferred angle for conversation, not standing over him, but level with him. And she put the formal question in the plain language of someone who did not have patience for ceremony's sake, but was honoring the form because the form mattered to her. By Orc custom of claiming, she said, I am asking you to stay, 1 season, in the eastern caves as part of Borgakh settlement's community. Working your trade here, living in my territory. At the end of the season, if you choose to stay and I choose to keep you, the name binding is made before witnesses and you are formally mine and I am formally yours. She paused. If you do not want to stay, you can leave with the council's payment and the agreement honored. No obligation beyond what you have already given. And if I want to stay, he asked. Then you stay, she said, as though it were the simplest thing in the world, which he was beginning to understand it actually was. Borgakh, he said, I was already planning to stay. I was planning to stay before I knew about the custom. The spring still needs proper maintenance work through the first winter to make sure the seal holds in the temperature drop, and the cistern overflow needs a secondary channel that I have not yet built, and the chimney shaft needs its floor reinforced where the surge undermined it. He looked at her directly. I have work here that I have not finished, and he stopped, picked the honest words carefully. I have a reason to finish it that I have not had before, a reason that is not the work itself. She was watching him, that level amber regard. You are the reason, he said, clearly, in case that needed to be said plainly. It did not need to be said plainly, she said. But I wanted to hear it. I know, he said. That is why I said it. She sat down beside him on the cliff wall, shoulder to shoulder, and he put his arm around her, somewhat carefully because she was large and the angle was somewhat awkward, and she laughed, a low, genuine sound he had heard perhaps twice, and which each time felt like receiving a gift he had not expected. She settled the awkwardness by simply turning slightly and pulling his arm more securely around her, arranging them with the practical authority she brought to everything. And they sat like that in the cooling night with the sea below them and the fires dying behind them. I should tell you something, she said after a comfortable while. Tell me. When you caught the braid in the chimney passage, she paused. I did not want to explain, not because I was ashamed and not because I thought you would refuse if you knew. I did not want to explain because another pause longer. He waited because he had learned that her pauses were worth waiting for. Because it felt like a gift, she said finally. That you did it without knowing, that it was something you did because it was simply you. Protecting something small from falling into the dark. Her voice was very level, but there was something exposed in it, something she was choosing to leave exposed. It felt true, and I wanted to keep it true before I had to put words around it. Clayton was quiet for a moment. You were right too, he said. It was true. I know that now, she said. Now I can say it. The name binding was held the next morning at dawn on the cliff shelf beside the cistern. Borgakh's choice of location, which Clayton thought was exactly right. Borgakh stood as the warband's witness, Marit as the settlement's witness, and 2 of Borgakh's closest war companions stood at the east and west of the shelf as secondary witnesses, which was the Orc customs requirement. The shelf was damp with morning sea mist, and the cistern was full, and the pipe was running clear, and the sky was the particular flat silver pink of early dawn on the coast. Borgakh stood before him in her warrior's leathers, the courtship braid over her left shoulder as it always was, and she said the words of the Orc name binding in her own language first. He could not follow them entirely, but he could hear in them a gravity and formality that told him this was not small to her, that she had carried this form in her memory and it meant something deep. And then she translated them, for him and for the record. I, Borgakh Doomhammer, blood of the warband, keeper of the eastern caves, name Clayton Slater as my chosen. I declare before these witnesses that I have found and claimed and will hold. I ask him to hold me in return. She looked at him. The dawn light was full on her face, the green of her skin warm in it, the amber of her eyes the same color as the light. He had not prepared words. He had thought about preparing words and had decided against it because he had learned that the words he prepared in advance were always the wrong ones, that the truest things he said were the ones he found in the moment. So he found them in the moment. "Borgakh," he said. "I've been a man who did work other people depended on and came home to nothing. I have spent a long time thinking that was enough. That being useful was enough." He paused. "You have in 23 days made that a different thing. You have made the returning matter. You have made me matter, not just the work." He swallowed. "I do not have an orc custom to say this in, but by whatever I have, which is my word and my will and my intention, I am choosing you, formally and on purpose as you required. I am choosing you." There was a sound from Marit that she quickly suppressed. Borgakh reached up and unplaited the courtship braid. It came loose in her fingers slowly, carefully, the red cord unwinding, the copper slip caught in her palm. She held it out to him on her open hand. "An orc, when the claiming is made, remakes the braid," she said. "But it is made differently when there is a chosen. The chosen braids it in with both their hands." She met his eyes. "If you are willing." He looked at the cord and the copper in her palm, and at the loose length of her hair where the braid had been, falling black and loose over her shoulder, and he reached out and took the cord from her palm and stepped close. He was not a man who knew anything about braiding hair. He told her so. She told him it did not need to be right by any standard except their own, and guided his hands with hers until the braid was loose and imperfect and thoroughly, obviously made by two people who were learning how to do it together. And then she guided the red cord through, and he pressed the copper slip into the end. And when it was done, she let it fall over her left shoulder where it always sat, and it was the same braid and different, and both of those things were the point. Borgakh said something in the orc tongue, short and formal, and the two war companions answered it, and Marit said, "Witnessed," in the settlement tradition, and that was done. Clayton looked at Borgakh. She looked at him. He kissed her then, there on the cliff shelf in the morning light, properly and without hesitation, one hand at the side of her jaw and the other somewhere in the territory of her shoulder. And she kissed him back with the same precise thoroughness she brought to everything, not tentative, not exploratory, but certain, like she had already decided how this would go and was now simply making it true. She was considerably stronger than him, which was simply a fact he had understood for weeks, and which he found in this moment to be an entirely excellent fact, and he kissed her with everything he had, which was not an inconsiderable amount. When they separated, Marit was looking at the cistern with tremendous focus, and Borgakh had turned to speak to his war companions, and the dawn was fully arrived and the sea was pale silver below them, and Borgakh was looking at Clayton with an expression he had no exact word for but which he understood completely. "A season," she said. "A season," he agreed. "And then?" she asked, which was not like her. She was not a person who asked and then, but this once she was asking. "And then we do this again, formally, permanently." He held her gaze. "And then you are my home and I am yours and neither of us comes back to nothing anymore." She nodded once slowly. Something in her face was very quiet and very full at the same time. "Good," she said. "That is what I wanted." The season that followed was the most textured and alive stretch of time that Clayton Slater had ever moved through. He finished the cistern overflow channel in the first week, while the settlement was still rebuilding from the surface damage the raiders had done. He reinforced the chimney shaft floor with cut stone brought down from the surface, sealing the undermined sections with mortar that he cured slowly against the cave's constant temperature, and he lined the spring cap joint with a secondary clay bead that would take the worst of the winter's thermal shift. The work was its own reward, as it always had been, but it was different now. It was work that he was doing for a place that had become, incrementally, and then all at once, his. The eastern caves were warm in the way that deep stone is warm, holding the geothermal heat of the cliff against the autumn cold that came off the sea in long gray sheets. He learned the layout of them the way he had learned all his best working sites, by feel, by the slow accumulation of days spent in them, until the passages were as known to him as his own hands. He learned Borgakh in the same way. She was not a gentle person by disposition, but she was a careful one, and careful, he discovered, was better. She had a particular way of watching him work that was not passive observation but active attention, an engagement that made him feel, for the first time in his professional life, that what he did with his hands was something worth paying that kind of attention to. She asked precise questions and accepted precise answers, and did not require anything to be made more important or more impressive than it actually was, which was a relief so profound he had not understood how much he had needed it until it was present. She taught him the names of the cave formations that her war band used as landmarks: the fan, the bishop's ear, the long sleep, and she taught him 3 phrases in the Orc tongue, one that meant "I am all right," one that meant "I need help," and one that meant, more or less, "You are the best thing I have found in a difficult place." She said this last one was useful, which he agreed it was, and he used it, and each time she heard it she went briefly and magnificently pleased in the way she went pleased, which was not a smile exactly but a quality of stillness that was its opposite. The coastal autumn was fierce, which everyone had warned him it would be. Storms came off the northern sea with the force of something that had been gathering momentum for weeks, and the coves became extremely loud as the surge pushed deep into the lower chambers, shaking the walls and filling the air with spray. During the worst of the equinox storms, the main cave entrance was sealed entirely, and the whole community lived by lantern light in the deep chambers for 3 days, which should have been miserable and was instead, for Clayton, the best 3 days he had spent in years. He and Borgakh and 4 of her warband companions played a game with tiles and chalk lines that he did not fully understand the rules of until the 3rd day, by which time he had lost comprehensively enough that Borgakh felt comfortable laughing openly about it, and the sound of her laughing filled the deep stone chamber and bounced off the vaulted ceiling and made the lanterns seem brighter. She had been in battles. He had known this intellectually, but the autumn, living close in the eastern caves, made him understand it differently, the particular way she held space around her that was not aggression but readiness, the scars on her arms that she never explained unless he asked specifically, which he sometimes did, the one on her right forearm from the battle at Redhorn, the one along her jaw that she had had since she was young and which was simply a piece of her face. He asked about them gently when it seemed right to ask, and she answered him with the same directness she brought to everything, and he listened to all of it. He told her things too. Things he had not told anyone in a long time, or had not told anyone at all. That the smallholding had failed not because of a drought, but because his father had made a bad deal in the last years of his life, mortgaging the future against a debt that came due when there was nothing left, and that Clayton had spent 5 years paying it down before he was finally clear of it and able to simply work and keep what he earned. That he had been offered a partnership with a Townwell business in the Eastern Marches and had turned it down because the partner was a man who put his name on other men's work, and he had decided that working alone was preferable to that. That he had been, for most of the past 9 years, genuinely and quietly lonely, in the specific way that a person who fills other people's lives with necessary things can be lonely, always needed, never particularly wanted. He said this last part on a night deep in the autumn, lying in the furbed of the eastern cave's main chamber with the storm loud outside and the hearth vent breathing warm air through the stone, and Borgakh was beside him, one arm along his ribs, her head tilted so that his shoulder served as her pillow, which it did completely adequately. Always needed, never wanted, she repeated. That is how it felt, yes. She was quiet for a moment, and then she lifted her head and looked at him with the directness that was simply her nature, and she said, "I want you, not the work, you. I want you in the room when the room is good and when it is not good. I want your voice when we do not agree and your hands when we go to sleep." She held his gaze with absolute steadiness. "I wanted you before the work was even done. I wanted you before I knew if you would say yes to any of this. I was watching you in the cave with your ear against the rock, listening to what the spring was telling you, and I thought, I want to hear what that sounds like to him. I want to hear all the things he has listened to in all the stone places." She put her head back on his shoulder. "You have been wanted," she said. "You simply were not in the right place before to find it." He put his arm around her and held her close, and he thought about the particular shape of the life he had been moving through for 9 years and the particular shape of the life he was in now, and the difference between them was not the place or the job or the comfort of the fur bed. The difference was her. Solid and warm and certain, and his. It was being wanted rather than needed, and the staggering, quiet revelation of how those two things were not the same. "Borgakh," he said. "Yes. The season is not over." "No," she agreed, "but I already know what I am going to say at the end of it." She made that low, resonant sound in her chest that was not quite a word. "I know that too," she said. "I have known it for some time." "How long?" "Since the cistern," she said simply. "Since you stood there and your eyes were full of the water running and you looked like someone seeing something sacred. I knew then that you were the kind of man who cares about the things he does enough to feel them that way, and I thought," a pause. "I thought, whatever he cares about that way, I want to be in that number." He tightened his arm around her. Outside, the storm pushed against the cliff face with everything it had, and the cave held, as good stone holds, as it has always held, solid and dark and enduring, full of the sound of water that had found its way. "You are in that number," he said. "You are at the top of that number." "I know," she said, and there was nothing arrogant in it, simply the same bedrock certainty she brought to all true things. Winter came to the coast in long, white, hammering sheets, and the cove settled into a different rhythm, slower in some ways, more intense in others, the community of the eastern caves drawing close around its hearths and its stores and its accumulated social warmth. Clayton finished the last of the planned infrastructure work in the early winter, the secondary overflow channel capped and sealed, the chimney shaft floor solid and tested, the spring's seasonal output measured and confirmed. And then he did something he had not done at a job site in 9 years. He stopped doing the job and started doing something else. He had always had some aptitude for carpentry. His father had built their house, and Clayton had built 2 rooms of it himself when he was young, and the skills had stayed with him in the way physical skills stay. He began building things for the eastern caves. A proper door for the main chamber's entrance from salvaged ship timber that Borgakh's band collected from the wreckwood on the beach. A series of deep shelves cut into a dry upper alcove for storing dry goods away from the moisture of the lower passages. A work table of heavy planks set on stone legs in the passage outside the main chamber door, where the lantern light was best, where he and Borgakh had fallen into the habit of sitting after the evening meal. She watched him build the table with the expression she brought to watching him do things with his hands, which was not passive admiration but the engaged attention of someone taking the measure of a skill, understanding how it worked. She asked questions. He showed her. She picked up the plane and ran it along the plank's edge with 2 passes that left it smooth, and she looked at the result and then looked at him with raised brows, and he said, "You have a very steady hand," and she said, "I have had practice with edges," which was entirely true in a different context, and they were both briefly very pleased about this. He was happy. The word felt almost inadequate for the thing it was supposed to describe, but it was the right word: happiness as a daily, ordinary condition, as the texture of the mornings when he woke with her warmth along his back and the sound of the sea and the stone, as the specific rightness of their life in the eastern caves through the long dark of winter. He was not lonely. He came back every night to being wanted. It was a thoroughly different country from the one he had lived in before, and he was grateful for it with a depth of feeling that had no adequate language and so mostly existed in the quality of his attention when he looked at her. Borgakh, for her part, seemed to have undergone some corresponding shift that was more internal than visible but which manifested in small, distinct ways. She laughed more, not often, but more. And when she laughed, it was without the brief, self-checking look that had preceded it in the early weeks, as though she had given herself permission to let it happen without auditing it first. She touched him more freely, and he had come to understand that this was significant for her, that physical affection was not something she had given easily in the past, and that giving it now was a choice she made consciously and with full intention, which made it feel every time like a gift rather than a habit. She used his name. She had started out calling him human, which had not been cold, simply categorical, and then had shifted to the plain Clayton, and now sometimes, in particular moments, in the particular voice that was the version of her voice she used only with him. It was my Clayton, possessive and easy, as natural as breathing, and each time she said it he felt it the way you feel the sun when it comes out from behind the cloud, with the whole body, suddenly, and more intensely for the time it was absent. The end of the season came with a week of sharp cold clear weather after the worst of the winter storms, the sky high and blue and the sea a hard dark gray, and everything on the coast standing in the kind of clean relief that only comes after prolonged bad weather has stripped the air of everything imprecise. Borgakh called the winter's end gathering in the settlement's central square, which was his custom regardless of whether the war band and the settlement community together, the accounts of the season balanced, the plans for the next season laid, anyone with business before the community bringing it. It was a practical form, not ceremonial, which was perhaps why Borgakh had chosen it. She stood in the square in her warrior's leathers, the remade courtship braid over her shoulder, and Clayton stood beside her, and Borgakh looked at them both and said, "The season is ended. Is the claiming to be made permanent?" in the tone of a man who knew the answer but was asking for the form's sake. "Yes," said Borgakh. "Yes," said Clayton. "Then say the second words," Borgakh said. Borgakh turned to face Clayton. The square was full, the war band, the settlement people, Marit with her arms folded and her sharp eyes bright. The wind was cold and the sky was that hard winter blue and everything was very clear. "By Orc law and Orc custom," Borgakh said, "and before these witnesses I name-bind Clayton Slater as my permanent chosen. Not for a season, not in trial, permanently. I hold him and he holds me, and neither of us stands in the open alone again." She reached forward and took both his hands in hers, her big thumbs pressing against his palms. "I choose you fully, on purpose." There was nothing he had prepared. There was only what was true. "I choose you, Borgakh Doomhammer," he said. "You are home and I am home, and that is what I am saying and all I need to say." He turned her hands over in his and pressed his lips to the back of her right hand, which was not an Orc custom but which was his, and she let him. And her expression in that moment was the thing he would keep longest and most carefully of everything he kept. Borgakh said the formal word 3 times. The warband answered it once each time. Marit said, "Witnessed, by settlement right," and added something under her breath that sounded personal and warm, and that Clayton decided not to ask about. Borgakh pulled him forward by the hands and kissed him in the open square with the full commitment she brought to all chosen things. And the settlement made whatever sound settlements make when they see something real, and the cold blue sky sat above them both and held no particular opinion but was present for it. And that was enough. The name-binding feast lasted until the fire coals were gray, and the stars were out, and most of the settlement was comfortably beyond sobriety. Borgakh had switched to water somewhere around the 3rd hour, which she did when she wanted to be present for something. And Clayton had drunk 2 cups of the Cove's local spirit fermented kelp and apple, which tasted better than it sounded. And they had sat at the long trestle table in the silt, and the stone with her hand resting on his knee under the table and his hand resting over it. And the warmth of the room and the noise of people celebrating and the particular solidity of her beside him had made him feel, with a totality he had never experienced before, that he had arrived somewhere. Not passed through, arrived. After the feast, In the eastern caves, with the hearth vent breathing and the sea outside carrying on its own endless business, she braided his hair for the first time. It was not long enough for a proper orc braid. He was aware of this, and she was aware of it, and it was one of the better pieces of evidence that she had a humor that ran dry and deep and required paying attention to catch. She braided what there was of it, the section at his nape, which was perhaps 4 inches, with the copper and red cord she had untied from her own braid during the ceremony and set aside for this purpose, and she worked it with her eyes very focused and her tongue slightly between her teeth, the way she looked when she was doing something that required care. And when it was done, she looked at it for a moment and said, "It is very small." "Yes," he agreed. "It is still yours," she said. "From mine. It counts." He took her face in his hands and kissed her, and she settled forward into him with the comfortable inevitability of 2 things that have been moving toward each other for long enough that the contact is simply restoration of a natural state. She was warm and strong and entirely present, and she wanted him not as a need or a debt or an obligation, wanted him the way the cove wants the tide, the way the rock wants the water that runs through it and makes it, over time, exactly what it is meant to be. He felt it in the way she moved and the way she stilled, in the particular gravity she brought to holding him close, in the low voice that was only his and the name she said in it that was only hers to say that way. She chose him, again, in the most private and direct language available, and he chose her in every way he knew how, and the hearth vent breathed and the sea talked outside the cliff and the stone held around them, as it had always held. The dawn came the way it always comes on that coast after a winter storm has finally blown itself out. Gray at the horizon first, then pale rose, then the cold, bright gold of clear air. Clayton was awake before her, which almost never happened. She was a light sleeper by warrior habit, but she had been deeply asleep, her face smoothed of its usual readiness, simply a face he loved, and he had lain still for a long time, not wanting to move and disturb it. He got up eventually, with the care of someone navigating a space he did not want to damage, and he went to the chimney shaft entrance and climbed through the familiar passage, past the reinforced floor, past the pipe he had laid, up through the cold dark to the shelf where the cistern sat. He opened the tap and filled the cup he had left there for this purpose and stood on the shelf in the first light, drinking cold, clean water from the spring he had found and capped and made useful, and he looked at the sea. It was very flat this morning, the storm entirely gone. The coast ran north and south in both directions, the cliffs sharp and clear, the settlement above still sleeping. Below, the cove mouths were dark and quiet. The rope and pulley systems at the cliff face were still, their lines hanging loose. The net drying racks were bare for winter. The whole coast was in the particular suspension of very early dawn, when the day has not yet committed to being anything, and everything is simply itself. Borgakh appeared at the chimney shaft entrance. She had dressed. She had found her leathers with the efficiency of someone who had been dressing in the dark since she could dress herself, and she came out onto the shelf and looked at the sea beside him and put her hand on his back, flat and warm between his shoulder blades. "You could not sleep?" she asked. "I woke up early. I wanted to see the dawn." She looked at the horizon. Then she took the cup from his hand, drank what was left of the water, handed it back. "The pipe is good," she said. "The pipe is very good," he agreed. "You are good," she said, with the simplicity of someone stating a technical fact. He put his arm around her and pulled her in, and she let him, putting her own arm around his back, her head tilting down to rest on top of his head because the angle of their heights made it work exactly that way, which always made him feel, impractically and entirely, like something that had been made to fit a specific place. "What do we do today?" she asked. He thought about it. The season was over. The name binding was done. The pipe was running. The cistern was full. The siege had been held. The fleet turned. The work completed and more than completed. For the first time in a very long time, there was no contract pressing, no deadline arriving, no emergency requiring the application of his particular skill to someone else's necessity. "Nothing," he said. "We do nothing that has to be done. We do whatever we want." She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when something landed in an unexpected place inside her. "I do not know the last time I did that," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "We will figure it out together." She laughed, low and genuine and entirely unheld back, the laugh that filled whatever space it was in and made it brighter, and the sound of it went out over the flat sea and into the pale morning air and did not come back, because that is what good sounds do. They go forward into the world, and they become part of whatever the world is from that moment on. They stood on the cliff shelf in the first gold of the dawn, the two of them and the sea and the cold air and the quiet settlement still sleeping above, and the pipe ran steadily behind them, delivering its clear and constant stream, and Borgakh's hand was warm on his back, and Clayton Slater was home. He was, at last, entirely and irrevocably home.